Okay, in this video, I'm going to give you a detailed overview of your Paper 1 assignment. So Paper 1 is due this coming Monday, September 7th. It's a holiday. We don't have class, but you do have an assignment due. In Blackboard, it says it's due by end of day Monday, 11:59 p.m., just before the stroke of midnight. However, I am not going to start grading at the stroke of midnight, so if your paper is in by say 8 a.m. the next day when I do plan to start grading, I won't count it as late. So do your best to get it in as early as possible, but as long as it's in by 8 a.m. Tuesday, September 8th, you'll be alright. Okay, basic instructions. So these instructions are 6 pages long, but here's the core. This is a short paper that summarizes and evaluates Mask of Kerr's argument. It definitely needs to do those things. I'll say more about summary versus evaluation and how much to summarize, but the paper essentially summarizes and evaluates Mask of Kerr's argument. In writing this summary and evaluation, you should draw on and integrate at least some point or argument or objection or question from the Brennan piece. And recall that the Brennan piece that we read is from an encyclopedia. The point of that piece is to give you a sketch of the background conversation of arguments related to voting, not to defend any particular view. So we read some features of this background conversation that connect with Mask of Kerr's argument. And you're supposed to draw on those and integrate them into your explanation and evaluation of this argument. And you're ultimately going to be making your own argument. But remember our definition of argument. An argument is a claim supported by reasons. So when you have a thesis or a main claim, it doesn't need to be a sweeping thesis about the duty to vote that captures everything in your heart about voting. It needs to be an arguable claim, a claim that people could disagree with that's supported by reasons. And because you're being asked to evaluate Mask of Kerr's argument, your claim could just be, is her argument good? Should we accept it? Or is a particular objection to her argument good? Does she respond adequately to a particular objection? An answer to any of those questions would be an arguable claim that you'd have to support with reasons. So when I say that you should be making an argument and you should have an explicitly stated main claim, it just needs to be the ultimate claim that you are making, perhaps about this argument, which you will support with reasons. Okay, so again, this is a short paper and this is a suggested length. If your paper is shorter than 2 pages, you probably can't do the task adequately, and that will be why you get a bad grade, not because of the page count itself. And if you go over 3 pages, that's not necessarily a problem. If you're really into argument analysis and evaluation and have a lot to say, and you want to write more, I'll accept it. If your extra pages are sort of redundant and off topic, that would count against your score. The point of this is to give you a sense of what you're being expected to do, and it's to be concise. Use the template. I'll go over the template in a moment. And here are some other basic sort of features of the formatting. There is a bibliography page, an argument map page, and a reflection page, and all of that's in the template. So let's look at this template right now. When you use this template, so in Blackboard, there's a link to make a copy of this Google Doc or to download a Word doc. I recommend the Google Doc if you use Google. Replace this with your own name and the date, your own title. This is dummy text that is also tips for writing a good, well-organized, argumentative paper. Erase this and replace it with your actual paper. This is dummy text. The bibliography is included for you. These are the only 2 sources that you are expected to use, and indeed you're expected to not consult any other sources. That being said, if you do, for whatever reason, if you look at anything in the process of writing this paper, include it in your bibliography. And here are templates for citing additional sources, but our citation format isn't important. What's important is that I could easily find anything that you're referring to. There's an argument map page. So what exactly is it you're supposed to map? Because you're being asked to do a color-coded map. And when should you do it? Is it you should write your paper and then map it? No. The mapping is the thinking part, right? So mapping is a way to grapple and think and plan. So do the thinking before you do the writing. Start with Mask of Kerr's argument. You've already mapped it, but probably there's room to revise your map. Even if you are really getting the hang of this argument mapping stuff, there's definitely going to be room to revise your map. I recommend looking at my map and either, revising yours in light of mine. It doesn't need to match mine exactly. Or you can borrow as much of mine as you want without worrying about copying. Just get them a good version of Mask of Kerr's map in place, and then make all of the boxes that are from her paper color-coded, so it's clear what is coming from her paper, what is summary. And then figure out where you could draw on the Brennan to add boxes or objections or clarifications or additional arguments into that map and color code those so it's clear what's in this argument. So now your map is starting to represent a conversation and not just Mask of Kerr. Color code what's coming from Brennan. And now the test of whether or not you are merely summarizing Mask of Kerr and or Brennan, or going beyond summary and adding something, evaluating, is where would you put your own boxes? So you might be tempted to evaluate an argument, say, and it is good. But then you wouldn't be adding any boxes. If you're not adding boxes, you're not adding anything to the conversation. So if you think the argument is good, one thing you could do is examine an objection and then evaluate that objection, including additional ones. So Mask of Kerr has objections in her argument that she responds to, but you could try to play devil's advocate and imagine how somebody could object to her objection and then evaluate that. So essentially, you should be adding boxes to the map. Once you have sort of planned what you're going to, by mapping and thinking and planning what you're going to write about, then write the paper. After you've made a complete draft of the paper, in your sort of revision process, use this checklist, annotations, and reflection question section. So there are instructions for you to annotate your paper, and if you aren't familiar with topic sentences, or sentence level transitions, or paragraph level transitions, or signal phrasing, you should either Google these things, or in Blackboard I have posted writing resources in the main menu, and I've hand-selected sources that I think are particularly good references for these kinds of skills. So check this out. Follow the instructions to annotate your final draft of the paper, answer the reflection questions, and also complete this checklist. So here's what you're going to be graded on, right? So make sure you follow the instructions, get the easiest points. Notice that the quality of the summary is worth the most points. So make sure that your summary is quality. Now, quick overview on summary. Don't forget, one, you've already written a summary for homework 1, and that assignment came with a guide/checklist for writing a good summary, so you might find it useful to consult that. Now, the goal of summarizing an argument is to essentially capture the argumentative structure, to be able to explain how exactly the argument works, how she reasons to various claims, or how she responds to objections to claims. Imagine you're writing for a general reader who knows how to map arguments, and they're going to have to map her argument based on your summary. Can you explain it so that it would be clear how to map it? And the way to do that is to use indicator words and sentence structure carefully. Okay, of course it should be accurate and charitable. And then another question people might have is, what does it mean to be developed in sufficient detail for my purposes? Do I need to summarize the whole argument? can I just copy and paste my whole homework 1 into my paper or what? And the answer is you will not need necessarily to summarize her whole argument. You're probably not going to be evaluating the whole argument, every facet of it. We'll look at the prompts in a moment, but if you're focused on some particular part of the argument, you might need to sketch the broader argument so it makes sense that this is what this is a part of. But the thing you need to summarize is whatever you're going to be evaluating in detail, because your evaluation won't make sense without the summary. So you're summarizing for your purposes. Summarize the part you're going to actually evaluate. And if that summary doesn't make sense without a bit more context, you might need to set up a little context, but the thing that needs to be carefully summarized is the part you evaluate. Okay, so quality of summary is worth the most. Again, you should have a specific arguable main claim, presumably about Maskivker's argument or some element of her argument. And your paper should involve reasoning of your own, and you should consider and respond to interesting objections to something you are saying or doing in the paper. If nobody would disagree with you, then maybe you're not saying something interesting and arguable, right? So your question should be sufficiently difficult that you're not 100% sure you're right. So where is there a weak spot, room for you to be wrong, and what do we think about that? And then general quality of writing. Here are some goals to aim for. And again, if you don't know what any of the words mean here, check out the writing resources in Blackboard. Okay, so that's the template and just the basic overview of sort of the assignment. The rest of the instructions here guide you to sort of how to think about the content of your assignment. What actually will you write about? And this is written to be essentially general advice for writing a philosophy paper. A philosophy paper will almost always ask you to engage with other arguments in a background conversation and be able to critically evaluate them, either as the sole purpose of the paper or in the process of developing your own point of view. You're not coming up with ideas in a vacuum. You're participating in an ongoing conversation that's been ongoing since BC era in many cases. Okay, so there's some advice for how to think about developing arguments about a good main claim and its connection to having a good question, and the stuff about seeing yourself as participating in a background conversation. One thing I want to emphasize is what it means to use sources, to effectively use sources. In a philosophy paper, what it means to use sources is to engage with their ideas and arguments. Not to use them to back up what you're saying, but to engage with them. And that's what you're doing in this paper by summarizing and evaluating Maskivker's argument. Okay, so a good main claim is an answer to a good guiding question. A good guiding question is an interesting, arguable one. A question that doesn't have an obvious answer, one that we can productively try to answer and compare and contrast arguments and evaluate arguments, but there's room for more than one interesting answer, and that's why it's worth reasoning through it. And there's sort of two ways to think about what's your biggest question for this paper. One could be, you have the same question Maskivker does. Is there a duty to vote, specifically in an informed and publicly spirited way? And since you have the same question as this person in the background conversation, you should engage with them in your paper, which will require you to summarize and evaluate what they said. Or, are you writing about Maskivker, such that your initial guiding question is Maskivker's argument good? Either way you think about it, you've got to summarize and evaluate her argument. Now, once you have sort of this big question in mind, for any paper like this, the next step is to narrow it down. So you can, the more specific your claim is, the more careful and rigorous your paper will be. And this is only a 2 to 3 page paper, so it's important to be narrow. Here are examples of more specific guiding questions. You would do well to just choose one of these as the prompt for your paper. So choose one of these as your prompt. You don't necessarily need to explicitly state this question in your paper, but your main claim should answer one of these questions. The instructions also include advice for writing the introduction along with samples, which I recommend you check out, as well as information or advice for writing the conclusion. And just want to highlight the number 1 and 2 things that you should avoid. Don't introduce your claim for the first time in the conclusion. Introduce it up front in the intro. It's not a surprise or a big reveal at the end. And don't undermine your main claim in the conclusion. So don't end with like, but who's to say, or I could be wrong, or we'll never know, or it's a difficult question and there's lots of room for disagreement. Some of those just plain undermine your claim. You're to say. What do you say and why? I know that you're not a know-it-all who's telling me the way the world is. You're a person who's interested in reasoning through an interesting question, and you're sharing your reasoning with a reader. So don't undermine it by saying you have no right to be saying the thing you're saying. And also, you don't need to tell us that it's like difficult and people will disagree, because that's why it's worth writing about. Okay, academic integrity and citing your sources. You should definitely write your own paper in your own words, and you should only use the 2 sources for a class. But again, if you happen to, for whatever reason, use any other source included in your bibliography, and then use lots of signal phrasing, like Maskov-Kerr claims, as Maskov-Kerr suggests, to make it clear when you are referring to her claims and arguments, or to Brennan's, and use the quote marks if you are directly quoting the argument, and just use the signal phrasing if it's merely paraphrasing. Again, here are the grading criteria. It's the same as what we looked at in the template. There's also a sample outline, just in case it's helpful, but you are not required to follow this outline exactly. And importantly, the outline is meant to indicate sections, not paragraphs. This shouldn't be a 5-paragraph paper, probably 1, 2, 3, or 4, whatever it is. Paragraphs should be, just generally rule of thumb, they're 1/3 to 1/2 page long. If they are longer than that, you probably have more than one point in that paragraph, one main idea. So try to keep one main idea per paragraph. In an argumentative paper, the main idea or topic sentence is usually a premise or a claim or an objection, and then the paragraph develops the support for that thing. So keep that in mind. Okay, so that's the instructions. We've got the template here, and again, you are allowed to use my Maskov-Kerr map as the starting point for your argument map, and you have the link to that if you completed homework 1. So check the feedback you received on homework 1, and that is where you will find my link to my Maskov-Kerr argument.